Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 34, Emperor Charles. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, after decades of war, Charles resolved to crush the Saxons once and for all. Several annual campaigns later, the Saxons had been pacified, but Charles was determined to prevent another revolt. So the Saxons were deported to other parts of the kingdom, and their lands were given to Frankish soldiers. Aside from the campaigns against the Saxons, Charles had standardized the Frankish currency to improve trade within the kingdom. Despite his ruthless extermination of Saxon resistance, Charles appeared to be feeling his age, so he spent most of his time in the spas at Aachen, which was becoming the capital of the expanded kingdom. Still, Charles wanted to ensure that there were no more raids into Aquitaine, so he instructed his son Louis to push south into Al-Andalus. Since Louis was not given an army, he was unlikely to gain much territory, but an opportunity soon appeared. Since Asturia was moving against the emirate, King Louis, guided by William of Toulouse, marched into Al-Andalus. The initial campaign was unsuccessful, but the Franks were persistent, so they had gained a base on the other side of the mountains by 799. Moreover, the Frankish invasion had distracted the emirate, enabling Alfonso to expand the territory of Asturia to reach Lisbon. Hakam had been unable to deal with the northern invasion because he was preoccupied with his rebellious uncles. However, the brothers refused to join forces, and neither man gained much support. After numerous small battles, Suleiman was captured and executed in 800. Abd Allah first tried to interest Charles in another trip south, but was rejected, so he set himself up in Valencia. Since the town was not officially ruled by Cordoba, Hakam was willing to recognize his uncle's autonomy in exchange for acknowledgement that Hakam was his overlord. Since Hakam had finally gained domestic stability, he should have been better prepared to resist the Franks. However, it was too late. The Franks had already gained a solid foothold on the southern side of the Pyrenees. Taking advantage of the base, Louis led a coalition that included nobles from Aquitaine, Burgundy, and Gascony to lay siege to Barcelona for nearly 2 years, until the starving, diseased residents finally surrendered in 801. Interesting, the early years of Louis's reign had been spent dealing with Gascon revolts. A few years later, they joined an invasion south. It is unlikely that the Gascons had suddenly learned to love their Frankish overlords. They probably just saw an opportunity to loot a Muslim city. While the gradual expansion into the Iberian Peninsula was undoubtedly good news, Charles had received disturbing news from Italy. Pope Hadrian had died in 795 and had been succeeded by Leo III. Charles and Hadrian had worked together for 2 decades. While the relationship had been strained at times, given Hadrian's numerous letters to Charles complaining that the papacy had not received as much land as he had expected, there had never been an open break between the two men. So, how were relations between Charles and the new pope? Fine. Leo seemed to lack his predecessor's ambition, so he did not press Charles for more land in Italy. Honestly, it is doubtful that Charles thought much about the papacy, since he was preoccupied with what he hoped would be the final pacification of the Saxons. Suddenly, Charles had to think about the papacy because the Pope had appeared in his kingdom, seeking sanctuary. Wow! Who had dared to attack Rome, which was under the protection of the powerful Frankish kingdom? No one. No, Leo had been attacked by a Roman mob on April 25, 799, and the mob was led by 3 nobles, 2 of whom were nephews of Hadrian. As the chief notary and the papal treasurer, they had overseen the administration of the papacy under Hadrian, and then arranged for the election of Leo as a figurehead. When he had attempted to actually serve as pope, they had launched a coup. A partially successful coup, since Leo had survived and escaped Italy. Obviously, he only had one option, the king of the Franks and the Lombards. When Pope Leo arrived in Aachen to request help to regain the papacy, Charles agreed and sent a strong escort to ensure that he reached Rome alive. The Pope arrived in Rome in the fall of 799, but Charles either had pressing business like the rule of a vast kingdom, or was not personally invested in Leo's situation, or both, since he remained in Aachen for over a year. Most likely, Charles was discussing with his advisors whether or not it was time to take the next step and become emperor. I really need to emphasize that the decision to become emperor was not made quickly. By 800, Charles had obviously advanced beyond the status of a mere ruler of a single kingdom. Admittedly, he had inherited a large kingdom, but he had greatly expanded that kingdom, conquering the Lombards in northern Italy, the Saxons in northern Germany, Bavaria, and the Avar territory that is in Austria. While Charles had taken several steps towards giving himself a promotion, calling himself King of the Franks and the Lombards, and holding a synod without consulting the Pope to determine the legitimacy of Irene's Second Council of Nicaea, he had not taken the final step of calling himself emperor. This caution is understandable since it would be a direct challenge to the Eastern Empire. More important, a ceremony was required to make the promotion legitimate, and such a ceremony would require the participation of the Pope, which would not come cheap. Remember, Charles had given the papacy lands to arrange the baptism and coronation of a son in 781, and then more lands to gain papal support for the annexation of Bavaria in 787. It is difficult to calculate the price of an imperial coronation, but Charles may have concluded that the price would not be worth the pleasure of introducing himself as emperor. It is important to point out that Charles was in Saxony, overseeing the final subjugation of the Saxons when he received the news of the attack on Pope Leo. The coup had good timing, well, good timing for Charles, since he had the opportunity to become emperor after he had completed the pacification of the Saxons. If Charles had not felt secure about Saxony, he would not have been able to spend so much time in Italy. Moreover, Charles had begun to look far beyond the immediate borders of his kingdom. Beginning in 797, Charles had sent numerous envoys to Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Baghdad. There are no records of the messages carried by the envoys, but Charles was clearly carving out a place on the international stage. Moreover, the Frankish kingdom looked peaceful and orderly when compared with the Eastern Empire. Constantine already struggled to maintain his hold on the throne, but he lost popularity when he forced his wife Maria to become a nun in January 795, even though there was no legal reason for the divorce. In fact, the church strongly opposed his divorce, and then the marriage to Theodote, a lady-in-waiting at court. Irene had been moving carefully against her son in the meantime. The army remained loyal to Irene, so Constantine was captured and blinded, which was considered more merciful than death. At least, it would have been more merciful than death, but blinding was a risky procedure and Constantine died soon after. A public announcement explained that Constantine could no longer rule, and new coins showed only Irene's image. Basically, she no longer ruled as regent or even co-empress, just empress. Presumably, some people were uncomfortable or even opposed to her rule, but few, if any, publicly criticized her. Obviously, Irene had already arranged for the support of the military, and the civil service was soon under the control of her loyalists. One explanation is that Irene had financed numerous public works in the capital and ensured that the public knew that she was responsible for the construction. Still, there was the question of what would happen when she died. While she undoubtedly had some popularity and no serious rival had organized a revolt, she was not a young woman since she was probably in her 40s. To be fair, Irene had probably not intended the blinding of her son to be fatal, but the act produced disgust in both Constantinople and the other major capitals. Moreover, Irene had been tolerated as a dowager regent because a regent's period of rule had a time limit. When she broke that limit and tried to rule on her own, It threatened the patriarchy that was the foundation of imperial society. If her son had died of natural causes, it might have been accepted, especially if she had proved competent. But he had not died of natural causes. So the international situation seemed favorable for a new Western empire. It is plausible that Charles told Leo that he would be happy to restore him to his papal throne if the Pope crowned him emperor. It does make sense and would have been a fair exchange. I just remain unconvinced that Leo was reluctant in the first place. Despite repeated attempts by popes to gain the submission of most of Italy, the papacy was mainly confined to the region around Rome. More important, Italy was becoming a dangerous place, so an official protector who conveniently lived far away probably did not seem like a bad thing. While Charles's actual intention is unclear, he definitely wanted to ensure that his kingdom was secure before starting a long journey. In March 800, he was on the Channel coast inspecting a new fleet of ships that had been built to counter the growing threat of Danish raiders. The Northerners had recently improved their shipbuilding skills when they began to build ships with a keel, which could sail much further. Suddenly, the Danes and the Norse could raid the coastal areas of England, or the Frankish coast on the North Sea, and the Channel. I will talk about the Vikings in more detail when I do a series in the Viking Age, but from Charles's perspective, the North Sea coast was suddenly vulnerable to raids from the north. Viking raiders, likely Norse, based in the Shetlands or the Orkneys, had sacked several famous monasteries in England, starting with Lindisfarne in 793. While these raids had sent shivers down the spines of monks like Alcuin, it is unlikely that Charles was especially bothered about the destruction of a remote monastery in someone else's kingdom. However, he was very concerned about the possibility of raids on the Frankish coast, therefore he had ordered the construction of a fleet. Actually, there was another reason to delay his trip south. Charles had to bury his wife. Liutgard had died of something in June. They had been married for 6 years, but they had no children. It is doubtful that Charles mourned her for long, but she seems to have been well liked in the court. Anyway, after ensuring that his northern coast was defended against Viking raids, Charles announced that he would travel to Italy. Arriving in Rome on November 24th, he was received by Pope Leo. Actually, the Pope was waiting outside the city, clearly determined to express his gratitude. It is important to stress that Leo was extremely grateful. While Pope Hadrian had been grateful to the king for help against the Lombards, he had still waited politely outside the Church of St. Peter's for Charles's arrival. Pope Leo knew that he desperately needed Charles, so he had traveled 12 miles outside the city to meet Charles and then escort him into the city. Actually, it was not clear that Leo would remain pope for long, since he faced severe criticism. The question was, who would judge a pope? Charles claimed that he lacked the authority to judge the merits of criticism against Leo, but he graciously agreed to attend a synod in Rome where Leo swore his innocence. Apparently, Charles's public support of the pope ended the matter, since the synod accepted Leo's claims. Conveniently, envoys from the Patriarch of Jerusalem had arrived around the same time as Charles reached Rome. This action was only done with the permission of the Caliph, who was the overlord of Jerusalem at the time, so it appeared that Caliph Harun al-Rashid viewed Charles as a peer. Remaining in Rome, Charles attended Christmas Mass, where at the end of the Mass, the Pope placed a small crown of gold on his head. In an instant, Charles had been acclaimed emperor. There is no record of the discussion between the king and the pope, so it is unknown if it was Charles's idea or the pope's. But the event is now viewed as the beginning of a new stage in European history. At this point, Charles became Charles the Great, or Charlemagne as he is known today. At the time, it was simply considered a rise in Charles's status. The remarkable aspect of the situation is that Leo claimed the right to appoint an emperor, thus greatly elevating the prestige of the papacy. Since Charles ruled almost all of the Christian lands that followed the lead of the Pope, it should not be a surprise that Leo wanted to make him emperor. So he would have an emperor who was closer in distance than the emperor in the east, who listened to the patriarch of Constantinople anyway. Most important, Charles had actually protected the papacy, unlike the Eastern emperor, who seemed to view Italy as a region to occupy and squeeze tax revenue from rather than protect. It is quite likely that the coronation had been arranged. Charles had acted like an emperor in calling a synod, and the audience had clearly been prepared to shout congratulations to the new emperor. Charles's main biographer Einhard later stated that Charles was angered by the coronation ceremony, but Einhard may have simply been trying to make Charles look modest. If he did not want the position, he did not show it, since Charles demanded that the papal chancellery date documents according to the year of his reign, as it had under previous emperors. Leo's coinage also had Charles's name and imperial title. The news of Charles's coronation would have been viewed in Constantinople as both an insult and a threat. It is important to remember that the Western emperor had always been appointed or at least approved by the Eastern emperor, so Constantinople was the senior partner in the empire. Since the Pope had neglected to even consult with Constantinople, the entire ceremony was considered an insult in Constantinople. Actually, there was a personnel change as a consequence of the coronation. While Charles's sons Pippin and Louis were sub-kings of Italy and Aquitaine respectively, Charles's eldest son, Charles the Younger, was not a king because he was based in the main Frankish kingdom, and there could not be two kings. Well, Charles had just been crowned emperor, so the position of king of the Franks had just become vacant. It did not remain vacant for long, since Charles the Younger was crowned king of the Franks on the same day that Charles became emperor. To sum up, Charles's son, Louis, king of Aquitaine, took advantage of domestic instability in the emirate of Cordoba to expand south of the Pyrenees. However, Charles found himself dealing with a coup in Rome when the relatives of the previous pope attempted to capture Leo, the current pope. Naturally, Charles agreed to guarantee Leo's safety in Rome. While there is no record of the discussions between the king and the pope, the two men clearly came to an agreement since Leo crowned Charles emperor. Honestly, the elevation in status should not have been a surprise, since Charles had advanced beyond the status of a mere king by this time. Moreover, the Eastern Empire was ruled by Empress Irene, who had seized power from her weak son. Still, the coronation was undoubtedly a dramatic step that would have shocked Constantinople. I will explore the reaction of the Eastern episode next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.